Greetings, this is Greg. In terms of bombing accuracy, what Allied plane in the European theater do you suppose was the best? In this video, we'll be looking at bombing results from some serious contenders. First up, we're going to look at the British heavies, meaning mostly Lancasters, then the American heavies, starting with the B-17 Flying Fortress with its Norden bomb sight, then the B-24 Liberator with, well, I never know what bomb sight Liberators were using on any given mission, because during this time period there were a lot of them around with the Sperry bomb sight. B-24 production switched to the Norden in early 1944. Then we have the U.S. medium bombers, coming in at a lower altitude, but using basically the same technology. So you might expect them to do quite a bit better in terms of accuracy than the U.S. heavies. We can look at the results from the B-25 Mitchell and the B-26 Marauder. As we go down in size and down in bomb load, we get to the Douglas A-20 Havoc. Next up, the de Havilland Mosquito, certainly one of the best planes of the war, and with a lot of fame from some high-profile bombing missions. After that, we'll compare fighters, or I suppose more correctly, fighter-bombers. With the P-47 Thunderbolt and the Supermarine Spitfire, I suppose the Spitfire is similar enough in terms of accuracy to substitute for a Typhoon or other liquid-cooled fighter bombers, but the numbers we will look at are specifically for the Spitfire. Bombing accuracy is a complex topic. There are very few apples-to-apples comparisons that can be made. However, in the European theater, there is one, and it's a good one. Crossbow, now commonly called Operation Crossbow due to a movie by that name, included Allied efforts to bomb V-1 launch sites. All the planes I just listed participated in Crossbow, and we have very solid information on the results, giving us some interesting comparative data. Before we continue, some shameless self-promotion, please like and subscribe, and consider joining my Patreon where I have the pilot's manuals for many of the planes featured in this video, as well as a treasure trove of historical books and documents. There is a link to my Patreon in the video description. Also, in my ongoing effort to avoid sponsorships, I commissioned some artwork for this video. You can get it on mugs or other items. Link in the description. The mugs are very high quality, look and feel great. Back to the video. For those who don't know, the V-1, also called the Buzz Bomb, and by various other names, was the world's first effective cruise missile. The Germans started using them in 1944, and each one could deliver its 850 kilogram, about 1,900 pound, warhead to a target about 250 kilometers from the launch point, which in practical terms meant they could hit London from their launch sites in France. Initially, it was only accurate enough to land within a circle with a 19-mile or about a 31-kilometer diameter. Later in the war, accuracy went up, and the diameter of that circle was reduced by almost 70%. But understand this was never a precision weapon, but could hit a general area like a city. The Allies were very concerned about the potential of the V-1. The weapon was cost-effective, hard to stop, and if used in sufficient numbers, or potentially with some alternate payloads, which thankfully never happened, it could potentially do some real damage. The Allies put a lot of effort into stopping the V-1s, and the end result was that the buzz bombs caused just under 23,000 casualties in about 12 months of use, about 6,000 deaths. Now that sounds like a lot, but in a proportional sense, and that's an important caveat here, a proportional sense, it's not. The Allies would send hundreds of heavy bombers to attack the Germans on a regular basis, each one of which carried 2 to 3 times the destructive power of a V-1 or more, and delivered this with much greater accuracy. It would not be unusual for the Allied bombing raids to cause twice as many civilian casualties in one day as 12 months of V-1 attacks. A big part of the reason casualties from V-1s were comparatively low was the effort the Allies put into stopping them. Part of that effort was bombing of the launch sites. Let's take a look at the results. I'm using information from this report, which has data on the tonnage dropped by various types of aircraft and the number of what the report calls, quote, A-kills, unquote. An A-kill or an A-strike means that sufficient damage was delivered to the launch site to knock it out of action for months. The least effective bombers by far were the British heavies. A V-1 launch site, often called a ski site because of the way the launch rail looks, is not a big target. It's hard to see from altitude and it's hard to hit. The crews of the British heavies were brave and generally very well accomplished during the war, but daylight bombing accuracy on such a small target wasn't really their thing. Their normal mission was to hit a city, not something small like a launch site. Furthermore, launch sites were camouflaged, and the Germans built decoy sites as well. From the operational analysis, quote, the RAF heavies dropped 3,500 tons on ski sites and did not achieve any Category A damage, unquote. Let's start a chart. 3,500 tons and a score of 0. Yes, I know that Lancasters could be more accurate in some situations. After all, they hit the Tirpitz. But that was a unique situation, a very different type of target in a very different environment. Crossbow provides accuracy data on the same type of target in the same environment for multiple aircraft. Next on the list, we have the B-24 Liberator. These planes knocked out 5 ski sites. However, they dropped 401.4 tons per Category A result. Certainly a lot better than the British heavies, but that's a lot of tonnage to knock out only 5 sites. The B-17s destroyed 30 ski sites, and in terms of accuracy did quite a bit better, with 195.1 tons dropped per Category A strike. So the U.S. heavies could and did knock out ski sites, but needed to drop a lot of tonnage to do the job. The big problem here, at least from a post-war point of view, was that of collateral damage. Not something that B-17 crews would think about much when bombing a target in Germany. After all, if bombing a ball bearing plant in a German city, the bombs that miss by a short distance still do damage to the enemy. Yes, civilians would be killed, which is tragic, but in World War II, bombing civilians was intentionally done all the time, so civilians being killed by collateral damage from a raid on a legitimate military target just wasn't a primary concern. However, the ski sites were in France and in rural or remote areas. So best case, the bombs that didn't hit the target damaged surrounding French countryside. Worst case, there were French casualties, and that happened quite a bit. The numbers were terrible here. There were about 13,000 French civilian casualties during Crossbow. That's more than half of all the British casualties caused by the V-1s themselves. Next up, we have the U.S. medium bombers. B-25 Mitchells knocked out 10.5 ski sites and used 244 tons for each one. The Martin B-26 Marauders knocked out 26, using 223 tons per A-strike. U.S. A-20 Havocs scored 4 A-strikes, using 313 tons of bombs for each one. The B-17 looks the best so far, but consider that it would take about 50 B-17s to deliver the average tonnage needed to knock out a ski site, plus the U.S. would lose 1.4 heavies from anti-aircraft fire per ski site destroyed. From a certain point of view, that's a win for the Germans. That's 50 B-17s that didn't bomb Germany that day, and 1.4 that never would. The medium bombers and the A-20 didn't come out much better, using even more tonnage, but with a lower loss rate of 0.77 losses per A-strike. You should also consider that there are less crew members lost with those smaller medium bombers. We don't have loss rates for the British heavies, but considering that the British heavies failed to score even a single A-kill, even if they lost only one airplane, the losses per A-kill are through the roof. What about the British Mosquito? It can come in low and fast enough that the German anti-aircraft fire will have little time to respond. Crossbow takes place in an area of Allied air superiority, so German fighters are a minimal threat. The Mosquito also bombs from fairly low altitude, which should help accuracy, and it does. The Mosquitoes knock out 19.5 ski sites using only 39.8 tons per strike to do it. Far better than any of the other bombers we've discussed so far. Of course, this makes a lot of sense considering the altitudes involved. On these sort of missions, Mosquitoes would typically cruise in at about 5,000 or 6,000 feet and dive on the target, releasing their bombs at about 1,500 feet. This method is more accurate than any heavy or medium bomber dropping its payload from up high. A book on the Mosquito gives the loss rates on these missions at 1.5%, which works out to about 0.6 losses per A-kill. Lower than the losses of any of the U.S. bombers, and of course with far lower crew losses, because the Mosquitoes only carry a 2-man crew. This same book, and a few others, seem to indicate that the version of the Mosquito most commonly used on these raids was the FB-6, a fighter-bomber variant, which would carry 2,000 pounds of bombs, 1,000 internally, two 500-pounders, one out on each wing. The Mosquito variants used on these missions is actually hard to determine with absolute certainty, but the squadrons most often associated with crossbow raids absolutely flew FB-6s during this time period. Of course, if the Mosquito could do these strikes with such accuracy, you have to ask, what about single-engine fighter bombers? We normally think of the Spitfire as a pure fighter, but it could carry bombs, and the V1 sites in France were within range of a bomb-carrying Spitfire. How do you think the Spitfire stacks up here? It's an interesting question, isn't it? We do have the answer. It had 3 Category A strikes, using 50.3 tons per strike, so they sent a lot of Spitfires on these missions. Now, that number, 50.3, is not as good as the Mosquito, but still pretty darn good. Now, I don't know the loss rates for the Spitfire. British loss rates were not listed in this report, and I couldn't find a secondary source giving crossbow loss rates for any of the British airplanes except for the Mosquito. Back to U.S. aircraft, in the European theater, there were 3 U.S. fighters often tasked with ground attack duties. These were the P-38 Lightning, the P-47 Thunderbolt, and the P-51 Mustang. Of these, few would argue that in the ground attack role, the Thunderbolt was the best, and it's the one used in crossbow. Now, there's an entire political rabbit hole you can go down on this, and I'm not going to do it right now. This video is focused on bombing accuracy statistics. The short version is that Hap Arnold himself wanted fighter bombers going after the V-1 launch sites, largely because he felt that his heavy bombers were better used bombing German industry. However, the forces against him on this one were too powerful, and it was rare that Hap Arnold didn't get his way, but this was one of those times. Hap Arnold also felt that fighter bombers would be the best way to go, and he wasn't just shooting in the dark here. At Eglin Field in Florida, he had simulated ski sites built and attacked by various methods. The results showed that minimal altitude attacks by fighters carrying 1,000 to 2,000 pound bomb loads were not only the most effective way to take out ski sites, but also the most economical. Officers from Eglin Field trained and briefed Thunderbolt pilots on this type of mission. Now, I'm not sure what that training consisted of. My guess is that it was a ground school type discussion of optimal speeds, dive angles, and release altitudes. 4 P-47 Thunderbolts were sent out on crossbow missions, each plane carrying 2 1,000-pound bombs. They scored 3 A strikes on 3 different ski sites. The Thunderbolts did take damage from the intense ground fire, but no planes were lost. Now, I realize the problem with a small statistical sample group, but in this case, it's all we have, and I think considering the Thunderbolt's overall record of destroying stuff on the ground, that it's a fair representation of the plane's ability. At 1.33 tons of bombs per destroyed V-1 site, in terms of accuracy during crossbow, the P-47 Thunderbolt is the absolute king. Yes, those 4 pilots had some sort of special training, but even if they were trained by Obi-Wan Kenobi himself, those results are so good we can't ignore them. Let's say these Thunderbolt pilots were 10 times better than average. That would mean the average Thunderbolt pilot would still only need 13.3 tons per A strike, about 3 times better than the next most accurate plane, the Mosquito, and far better than any other plane in crossbow. The numbers just aren't even comparable. The tests at Eglin Field and Hap Arnold himself favored using the Thunderbolt over medium or heavy bombers. The actual mission results support that too, yet all the focus was still on the heavies, and the reasons have to do with both British and American politics and military bureaucracy, and that topic is just too deep to get into in this video. The next question is, why was the Thunderbolt so accurate? Yes, low-altitude bomb release helps, but that would have been true for the Spitfire as well. I think a big factor here was the Thunderbolt pilot's confidence that he could take a few hits and likely still get home. The plane's R-2800 engine was legendary for taking abuse and continuing on. The airframe was strong too, with triple wing spars and generally very strong construction. The pilot was well protected by not only what I'll call the normal amount of armor plate for U.S. Army Air Force fighter, but also by self-sealing fuel tanks and a fuselage full of turbo supercharging stuff, the big turbo, intercooler piping, and other stuff that would slow down and deform bullets before they even reach the armor plate. I think that, especially as compared to the Spitfire, a Thunderbolt pilot would feel a bit safer flying a stabilized bomb run to a target knowing he is likely to catch at least a few machine gun rounds. Of course, this is impossible to quantify, but again, we can't ignore those numbers. The P-47 was by far the most accurate bomber in Operation Crossbow. I mentioned earlier that I commissioned Spacer for the artwork used in this video. Links to the mugs are in the description, as well as Spacer's contact information. That's all for now. Goodbye and have a great day.